You're just a bitter old woman jealous of what I have and my parents' wealth. The words echoed across the lakehouse dining room. Rain hammered the windows. Everyone at the table froze, forks halfway to their mouths. Bryce stared at me, his face twisted with contempt. I felt the room tilt. My fork scraped against the porcelain plate, the sound sharp and final. I looked at my husband Walter, waiting for him to defend me. He cleared his throat and looked down at his mashed potatoes. He has a point, Ruth. The betrayal hit harder than Bryce's insult. My chest tightened. I heard Diane, Bryce's mother, let out a soft, satisfied laugh from across the table. My daughter Kelly said nothing, just studied her wine glass like it held all the answers in the world. I set my fork down carefully. I stood up without saying a word and walked to the guest bedroom. Nobody called after me. Nobody apologized. I packed my overnight bag with trembling hands. Please tell me something in the comments section. Where are you watching this story from? And take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, because every day there's a real story that will shake your heart. My name is Ruth Ellison. I'm 87 years old, and that Sunday evening changed everything. That was the moment I stopped being invisible. 3 years before that terrible dinner, Kelly called me in tears. She and Bryce had found a house they loved, but they were short on the down payment. Her voice cracked over the phone. Mom, it's perfect. Close to work, good schools nearby. But we need help. I didn't hesitate. I had savings from my late mother's estate. Money I'd always planned to leave Kelly anyway. Why not give it to her now when she needs it most? But I wasn't foolish. I'd worked 40 years as a bank secretary. I knew how money could ruin relationships if handled carelessly. I'll help, I told Kelly. But let's do it properly. A loan with a promissory note. Kelly agreed immediately. Bryce sounded less enthusiastic when I explained it to him, but he went along with it. We met at the title office on closing day. I slid a cashier's check across the table. $50,000. The lawyer had prepared a promissory note, secured by a recorded lien against the property. When Bryce saw the paperwork, his smile disappeared. Diane leaned over and whispered something in his ear. We'll sort that out later, she said sweetly. I filed every single document in a labeled binder when I got home. It wasn't difficult. I was being smart. That same afternoon at the title office, I excused myself to use the restroom. The building was old, with thin walls. As I walked down the narrow hallway, I heard voices coming from a small break room. The door was slightly open. It was Diane's voice, sharp and calculating. Once Ruth's gone, that back lot will be perfect for the emergency access road. Arthur's been planning it for months. It's just a tiny task, really. I froze in the hallway, my hand gripping my purse. Arthur was Diane's husband, Bryce's father. He was a property developer, but I had no idea he'd been making plans that involved my land. I owned 5 acres of woods behind my house. Thick forest with a creek running through it. My mother loved those woods. I'd scattered her ashes there under the old oak tree. I stood there, my heart pounding in my ears, and realized this wasn't just about helping my daughter buy a house. This was something bigger, something darker. I walked back to the conference room and signed everything with a pleasant smile. I shook hands, thanked the lawyer, and drove home. But that night I couldn't sleep. 6 months passed quietly. Kelly and Bryce settled into their new house. I visited sometimes, bringing groceries or helping Kelly plant tulips in the garden. Bryce was always polite but cold. He worked long hours at his father's development company. Then one Tuesday morning, Bryce and Diane showed up at my door without calling first. Bryce carried a leather folder filled with glossy brochures. We sat at my kitchen island. My coffee grew cold as I listened to them talk. Ruth, we've been thinking, Diane began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. You're getting older. This big house, living alone. It's not safe anymore. Bryce spread brochures across the counter. Assisted living facilities. Retirement homes. Places with names like Sunset Meadows and Golden Years Village. Just sign this so we can help you, Bryce said, sliding a document toward me. I picked it up and read it carefully. Power of attorney. It would give them complete control over my finances, my property, my entire life. Walter sat beside me, nodding along like a dashboard ornament. They have a point, Ruth. Might be easier for everyone. My hand stopped trembling. I looked Bryce directly in the eyes. No. Bryce laughed like I'd made a joke. Don't be stubborn, Ruth. I said no. I pushed the papers back across the counter. That afternoon, I called a legal aid clinic I'd found online. The county clerk's office smelled like old paper and toner ink. I stood at the front counter, waiting while the clerk searched for the records I'd requested. I'd asked to see public documents for a development called Birchview Villas. Arthur Wallace's name was listed as the primary applicant. The clerk returned and spread several documents across the counter. I leaned in, squinting at the site map through my reading glasses. There it was. A proposed emergency access road cutting straight through the heart of my woods. The developer's notes claimed the road was necessary for fire trucks and ambulances. But I knew better. Arthur wanted a shortcut to connect two sections of his luxury housing development. My land was in his way. I pressed my palm flat against the paper. The tremor in my hand stopped completely. I'd like copies of everything, I told the clerk. I paid the fee, tucked the documents into my coat pocket, and walked outside into the November cold. The zoning hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks from today. I had work to do. Attorney Paige O'Rourke's office had afternoon sunlight streaming through dusty blinds. She sat across from me, reviewing every document in my binder. She was maybe 40 years old, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. You did everything right, Paige said, tapping the promissory note with her pen. This is legally solid. Relief flooded through me. I'd been worried my paperwork wouldn't hold up in court. Paige leaned forward, her expression serious. But Ruth, given what you've told me about your son-in-law's family, I strongly suggest you get a capacity evaluation done now. A what? A formal medical assessment proving you're mentally competent. If they try to claim you're confused or incompetent, we'll have documentation proving otherwise. My stomach twisted. Would they really go that far? Paige must have seen my face. It's just a precaution. Also, I recommend setting up a revocable trust and naming someone you trust as your medical and financial agent. Not Walter. I thought immediately of my neighbor, Beverly Talbot. Bev and I had been friends for 30 years. She was honest, practical, and nobody could push her around. I know exactly who to ask, I said. I left Paige's office with 3 appointments scheduled and a clear plan. For the first time in months, I felt something other than fear. The geriatric clinic smelled like antiseptic and vanilla air freshener. Dr. Keating, a kind woman in her 50s, walked me through a battery of tests. Memory tests, reasoning puzzles, judgment questions. She asked me to draw a clock showing 10 minutes past 11. I drew it perfectly, numbers in the right places, hands pointing correctly. She gave me a list of 5 words to remember. Apple, table, penny, sunset, river. 5 minutes later, after asking me other questions, she asked me to repeat the list. I remembered all 5 words in order. She described complicated situations and asked what I would do. I answered each one clearly, explaining my reasoning. When we finished, Dr. Keating smiled warmly. Ruth, your cognitive function is excellent. You have full decision-making capacity. She typed up a formal report and handed me a sealed copy. I tucked it into my purse, right behind the promissory note. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Diane. Dinner this Sunday? I would love to see you. I stared at that cheerful emoji for a long moment. What were they planning now? I texted back. I'll be there. Sunday brunch at the Wallace estate was exactly what I expected. The house was massive, all glass walls and steel beams, overlooking a private lake. Diane served mimosas in crystal glasses and pastries arranged on silver trays. Arthur sat at the head of the long table, smiling broadly. Ruth, wonderful to see you. We had a polite conversation for 20 minutes. Weather. News. Nothing important. Then Diane leaned forward, her voice light and casual. Ruth, we've been thinking. We'd love to make a donation toward your future care. You know, to help with any expenses down the road. That's generous of you, I said carefully. In exchange, Arthur added smoothly, we just need a small strip of your back lot. For the Birchview development. Emergency access only. He unfolded a map and pointed to a red line. The proposed road would slice right through the center of my woods, destroying the creek and the old oak tree. We could even name a gazebo after you, Diane said brightly. The Ruth Ellison Memorial Gazebo. Wouldn't that be lovely? I tapped my finger on the map. No. The room went completely silent. Diane's smile turned brittle. Ruth, there are friendlier ways to handle this. I stood up, leaving my untouched mimosa on the table. I'm sure there are. But my answer is still no. I walked out. Behind me, Diane's heels clicked sharply on the marble floor, but she didn't follow me outside. Carmen Lopez from Maple Creek Land Trust met me at the edge of my property on a clear Thursday morning. The forest was alive with birdsong. A small brook bubbled over smooth stones covered in moss. Carmen knelt down, examining the ground carefully. This is a genuine wildlife corridor, Ruth. Deer, foxes, migratory songbirds. It's extremely rare to find undisturbed habitat this close to town. My mother walked here every morning, I said quietly, until the day she died. Carmen stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. We can protect it permanently. A conservation easement would prevent any development forever. You'd keep ownership, keep living here. But the land itself would be preserved for future generations. Would it stop Arthur's access road? Absolutely. Once the easement is recorded with the county, no one can build on this land. Ever. I looked out at the trees, watching sunlight filter through the leaves in golden streams. I thought about my mother. About Kelly's baby, whenever that happened. About the fox I sometimes saw at dusk. Let's protect it, I said firmly. Carmen smiled. I'll schedule the survey team for next week. For the first time in months, my chest felt light. I could breathe normally again. That Sunday, I made meatloaf for dinner. Walter, Kelly, Bryce, and I gathered around my dining table. I passed the bowl of mashed potatoes and mentioned casually, Carmen from the Land Trust is coming tomorrow. We're finalizing the conservation easement. Bryce's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He stared at me. Diane, who'd somehow invited herself to dinner again, set down her wine glass very carefully. That survey is all ready. She stopped mid-sentence, her face flushing. Kelly looked confused. Mom, what easement? I'm placing a conservation easement on the back 5 acres. The woods will be protected permanently. No development allowed. Bryce shoved his chair back so hard it scraped loudly against the floor. You can't do that. I already did. The papers are signed. Diane stared at Arthur, who sat frozen, his jaw clenched tight. After dinner, everyone left quickly. No one helped me wash dishes. The next morning, I woke to find a white SUV parked at my curb. Arthur sat in the driver's seat, staring at my house. When he noticed me looking through the window, he drove away slowly. The county recorder's office was busy with lunchtime traffic. I stood in line, clutching the conservation easement documents against my chest. When my turn came, I slid the papers across the counter to the clerk. She reviewed them, stamped each page with a loud thunk, and entered the information into the computer. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. And just like that, it was done. Recorded. Legal. Permanent. I kept a life estate, meaning I could live on the land for the rest of my life. I also granted a narrow public footpath, so neighbors could walk through the woods respectfully. But no one could ever build there. No roads. No houses. No development. That night my phone rang. Arthur's name lit up the screen. You've made a serious mistake, Ruth. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the dark tree line. I made a choice, Arthur. There's a difference. He hung up without another word. An hour later, I heard footsteps upstairs. Walter was opening and closing drawers. I climbed the stairs slowly and found him packing a suitcase. What are you doing? He wouldn't meet my eyes. You embarrassed them, Ruth. They've looked out for us. This is too much. Looked out for us. Or manipulated us. He zipped the suitcase with sharp, angry movements. I'm staying with Kelly and Bryce for a while. I watched him carry his bag down the stairs. I watched his taillights fade down the driveway into darkness. Then I went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and opened my binder. Alone, yes, but not unprepared. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived by certified mail. Inside was a court summons. Diane's lawyer had filed a petition for guardianship over me, claiming I was mentally confused and at risk of self-harm through poor financial decisions. My hands shook as I read the legal language. They were trying to take away my independence, my rights, my entire life. I called Paige immediately. We met at the courthouse the following week. We sat on a wooden bench in the hallway outside the courtroom, reviewing our strategy. Don't worry, Paige said calmly. We have everything we need. Inside the courtroom, Judge Whitaker listened to Diane's lawyer describe me as a confused elderly woman making irrational choices. He pointed to the conservation easement as proof of my declining judgment and mental capacity. Then Paige stood. She handed Judge Whitaker Dr. Keating's detailed capacity evaluation. She presented records of my volunteer work at the hospital, my bank statements showing careful financial management, and letters from neighbors attesting to my sharp mind. Judge Whitaker read everything thoroughly. Then he looked at Diane over his reading glasses. Guardianship petition denied. Mrs. Ellison is clearly competent and capable. Do not misuse this court's time again. Diane's jaw clenched. As we left the courtroom, I heard Bryce mutter to her. Fine. Then we do it the hard way. That evening, Kelly sent me a text. Can I come by? Alone. Kelly arrived the next afternoon. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes. We sat in my living room with tea cooling between us on the coffee table. Mom, I need to tell you something. Her voice cracked. I'm pregnant. My hands flew to my mouth. Joy and worry crashed together in my chest. Oh, sweetheart. That's wonderful. Kelly started crying, tears streaming down her face. Bryce handles all our money. He won't tell me anything about our finances. When I ask questions, he gets angry and tells me I'm being paranoid. I moved to sit beside her on the couch, wrapping my arm around her trembling shoulders. How far along are you? 12 weeks. I held her while she cried, stroking her hair like I did when she was little. When she finally calmed down, I made her a promise. I'll be there for this baby, Kelly. Always. But I need to set one boundary with Bryce. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. I walked to my desk and pulled the promissory note from my binder. Bryce borrowed $50,000 from me 3 years ago. He signed a legal agreement promising to pay it back. He hasn't made a single payment. Kelly stared at the document like she'd never seen it before. I didn't know about this. I'm calling the loan due. It's time he kept his word. I mailed the certified letter on Monday morning. The letter was straightforward and legal. I was exercising my right to call the note due. Full payment required within 30 days. But I also included an offer of mercy. I would waive all accumulated interest and extend the payment timeline if Bryce agreed to 2 conditions. Attend financial counseling with Kelly, and treat me with basic human respect going forward. Bryce appeared at my door 2 days later. His face was red, his fists clenched at his sides. You're shaking us down, he shouted from my porch. We're about to have a baby, and you're demanding money like some loan shark? I stood calmly in my doorway. I'm holding you to your written promise. You signed a promissory note, Bryce. You're a miserable, bitter old woman. Maybe I am. But I'm a miserable old woman who expects people to honor their agreements. He stormed back to his truck. The door slammed so violently I heard it echo from inside my house. The 30-day countdown had officially begun. The county zoning board meeting was held in a cramped community center that smelled like old carpet. About 40 people filled the folding chairs. Arthur sat in the front row with his architect beside him, presenting updated plans for Birchview Villas. When his turn came, Arthur stood at the podium looking confident and polished. He explained the critical need for emergency vehicle access, showed traffic studies, and made everything sound completely reasonable. Then one board member asked about the proposed route. We're currently exploring alternative access options, Arthur said carefully, due to some unexpected complications with the original plan. Another board member pulled out a map. Your original proposal cut directly through a recently established conservation easement. Is that correct? Arthur's confident expression cracked slightly. We're making adjustments to accommodate that situation. The board spent an hour discussing stream buffers, traffic impact, wetland protection, and safety regulations. Finally, they voted. Motion denied. The alternative routes were too expensive and would cause unacceptable environmental damage to protected wetlands. Birchview Villas would have to be completely redesigned if it could proceed at all. Diane sat rigid in the third row, her face blotched red. She didn't look at anyone. As people filed out, I overheard a neighbor whisper to another, I wonder if that old woman is really safe living alone like that. Another echo of Diane's smear campaign. But now people are starting to see the truth. Kelly came to visit again a week later, this time without telling Bryce. She looked even more tired than before, her pregnancy starting to show. Mom, I found something. She pulled out a thick stack of papers from her purse. Bryce took out a second mortgage on our house without really explaining it to me. He said it was to consolidate debt, and I had to sign immediately. I examined the documents carefully. The interest rate was outrageous, predatory even. And it was adjustable, set to increase dramatically in just 6 months. Did you want to sign this? He said I had no choice. He said it was the only way to keep us from losing everything. Anger rose in my chest, but I kept my voice steady and calm. Kelly, there are laws protecting people from being coerced into signing financial documents they don't understand. She started crying again, her shoulders shaking. I don't know what to do anymore. I picked up my phone and called a housing counselor I'd known from my banking days. I scheduled a free confidential appointment for Kelly that same week. You're going to talk to someone who can explain your real options, I told her. Kelly nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue. 3 days later, I received a frantic call. Walter had collapsed during dinner at the Wallace's house. The hospital hallways smelled like disinfectant and anxiety. Walter lay in a narrow bed, looking smaller and frilier than I'd ever seen him. The doctor explained he'd suffered a minor stroke. Not life-threatening, but definitely serious. Diane was supposedly in an important meeting. Bryce had urgent business calls he couldn't miss. I sat alone beside Walter's hospital bed, holding his trembling hand in mine. I'm sorry, he whispered, his words slightly slurred from the stroke. I've been so ashamed. I sided against you when I should have supported you. I know. They made it sound like you were being unreasonable and difficult. But you weren't. You were just protecting yourself and Kelly. I squeezed his hand gently. Rest now. We'll talk later. Over the next week, I arranged Walter's entire rehabilitation schedule. I visited him every single day, bringing books and his favorite foods. And I also did something else. I met with Paige again in her office. I need a post-nuptial agreement. I want my assets and my property legally separated from Walter's finances. Walter, humbled by his stroke and ashamed of his earlier betrayal, signed the agreement without a single argument. The mediation session took place in a bland conference room with generic corporate artwork on the beige walls. Paige sat beside me, her briefcase open and organized. Across the table, Bryce and Diane had hired their own attorney, a sharp-faced man in an expensive suit. The mediator, a patient middle-aged man named Mr. Thornton, carefully reviewed the promissory note and supporting documents. Mrs. Ellison is well within her legal rights to demand full payment, he said neutrally. However, she's offered extremely reasonable alternative terms. I repeated my offer clearly. Extended payment timeline. Complete forgiveness of all interest. Required financial counseling for both Bryce and Kelly. And one additional condition. No more public disrespect or manipulation. Bryce made a disgusted sound. This is straight-up blackmail. Diane leaned close and whispered urgently in his ear. He shook his head stubbornly. We're not agreeing to any of this, Bryce announced. Mr. Thornton sighed heavily and closed his folder. Then you'll need to resolve this matter before a judge. Bryce and Diane stood abruptly and walked out of the mediation without another word. 2 weeks later, the bank officially filed a notice of default on Bryce's second mortgage. The countdown to foreclosure had begun. Civil court was less dramatic than television makes it look. Judge Whitaker, who'd presided over the guardianship hearing, was assigned to this case as well. Paige methodically walked him through everything. The original loan, the signed promissory note, the recorded line, the complete absence of payments. Kelly testified, her pregnant belly visible now, her voice shaking but determined. She explained how Bryce had pressured her to sign the second mortgage, how he'd kept her completely in the dark about their deteriorating financial situation. Bryce tried to paint me as vindictive and cruel. She's doing this because we wouldn't give her what she wanted. She's punishing us. Judge Whitaker cut him off sharply. Mr. Wallace, you signed a legal document. You borrowed a substantial sum of money and explicitly agreed to repay it. That's not vindictive. That's a binding contract. The judge ruled entirely in my favor. Bryce had exactly 45 days to pay the full amount owed, or the house would be sold at auction to satisfy the outstanding debt. As we left the courtroom, Kelly suddenly grabbed my arm. Her face had gone completely pale. "Mom, something's wrong. I don't feel right." We rushed straight to the hospital emergency room. Kelly went into premature labor, a full month ahead of her due date. The baby was tiny but miraculously healthy. A beautiful girl. Kelly, exhausted and overwhelmed, named her Claire. I sat beside Kelly's hospital bed, holding little Claire in my arms. She was so incredibly small, her fingers like delicate flower stems, her breathing soft and steady. Bryce was conspicuously absent, supposedly handling important business matters. I brought Kelly nutritious meals, helped with the baby constantly, and made sure she had everything she possibly needed. The 45-day deadline crept steadily closer. No payment arrived. No communication from Bryce or his parents. I didn't want to proceed with the sale, but I had no other choice. I filed all the necessary legal paperwork to move forward with the foreclosure auction. No drama. No public announcements. Just quiet, methodical legal steps. Then, exactly 3 days before the final deadline, Diane appeared at my front door. She stood on my porch holding a white envelope, her makeup smudged, her eyes red and glossy. "Please, Ruth," she said quietly. "Can we please talk?" We sat across from each other at my kitchen table. Diane slid the envelope slowly across to me. Inside was a check for $25,000. "It's half of what he owes," she said, her voice strained. "Please, Ruth, be reasonable about this." I looked at the check, then directly at her face. "Half isn't what the agreement says. We don't have the rest. Arthur's development has completely failed. We've lost every major investor. Bryce doesn't have any steady income anymore." I felt something flicker inside me. Not quite a pity. Not satisfied either. Something more complicated. "I'll make you one final offer," I said slowly. "I'll forgive the entire debt completely under 3 specific conditions." Diane leaned forward eagerly. 1. Bryce gets genuine professional counseling for his behavior and anger issues. 2. He writes me a sincere, handwritten apology letter. 3. He signs a legal document promising never to control or interfere with Kelly's earnings or financial decisions again. Diane's face hardened instantly. "We don't grovel to anyone, Ruth. Especially not to you." "Then we're finished here." She left the check on my table and walked out, her heels clicking sharply. 5 days later, the auction date appeared on the official court calendar like an approaching storm. The courthouse steps were crowded with curious onlookers and potential bidders. I stood off to the side, watching the auctioneer set up his podium and microphone. Kelly had asked me not to tell her when the auction was happening. She couldn't bear to watch. The bidding started promptly at 10 o'clock. Several people raised their numbered paddles. The price climbed steadily. The house was in an excellent neighborhood, well-maintained and move-in ready. Finally, a young couple won the bidding. Sam and Olivia Henderson, newlyweds with a conventional mortgage already approved by their bank. Bryce stood near his parked car, his face completely drained of color. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely frightened. The sale was legal, clean, and absolutely final. After the auction concluded, I approached Sam and Olivia cautiously. "Excuse me, could I possibly speak with you both for just a moment?" They looked nervous but agreed to listen. I made them an unusual request. Something I hoped desperately would help Kelly and baby Claire. I met Sam and Olivia at a quiet coffee shop the very next morning. I explained the situation as honestly as I could. My daughter was a brand new mother. She needed stability and time to find affordable rental housing. I'd like to arrange a 6-month leaseback agreement, I proposed carefully. I'll pay the monthly rent directly to you. Kelly and baby Claire can stay in the house while she gets back on her feet. Sam looked at Olivia. What about her husband? Bryce can only stay if he agrees to attend weekly counseling sessions and signs a written agreement promising to treat both Kelly and me with basic respect. They exchanged glances, thinking it over carefully. Finally, Sam nodded. Our closing isn't for another month anyway. We can definitely do that. I worked with Paige to draw up proper legal paperwork. Kelly, exhausted and grateful, agreed immediately to the arrangement. Bryce initially refused. You're deliberately humiliating me in front of everyone. Kelly, holding baby Claire protectively against her chest, looked at him with surprising strength. Then leave. We don't need you. He didn't leave, but 3 days later he quietly signed the agreement. That same week, I received an unexpected call from the hospital where I'd been volunteering for 20 years. The hospital administrator, Mrs. Patterson, called to invite me to a small dedication ceremony. I'd been privately funding a new caregiver's lounge in my late mother's name for the past year. Construction was finally complete. We'd be honored if you would cut the ceremonial ribbon, Mrs. Patterson said warmly. I agreed. Feeling genuine warmth spread through my chest. But there was additional news. During the required ethics review for my donation project, Diane had been formally investigated. Multiple staff members had reported that she'd aggressively tried to pressure them into blocking my donation, spreading vicious rumors that I was mentally incompetent and dangerous. The hospital ethics committee had officially reprimanded her. She was immediately removed from a prestigious hospital advisory board. In their wealthy social circle, that kind of public reprimand was absolutely devastating. Word spread quickly through their community. Arthur's few remaining investors completely backed out of Birchview Villas. The entire project collapsed permanently. 2 weeks after the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Bryce appeared alone on my porch one evening. Bryce stood on my porch looking hollow and thin. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Help me," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Walter appeared beside me, leaning heavily on his cane. His stroke had left him physically weaker, but somehow mentally clearer and stronger. I didn't invite Bryce inside my house. Instead, I handed him several items I'd prepared. A pamphlet for a good counseling center. A printed list of upcoming job fairs in the area. Grocery store gift cards specifically for baby supplies. No loans, I said firmly. No shortcuts or easy fixes. If you genuinely want help, you have to do the actual work yourself. He stared at the items in his hands for a long moment. I thought he might throw everything back at me angrily. Instead, he nodded once slowly and walked back to his car. The door closed softly this time, not slammed. 3 months later, I stood in the hospital's beautiful new caregiver's lounge. Soft, comfortable chairs. Warm lighting. A small kitchen area. A peaceful place for exhausted family members to rest and breathe. A polished plaque on the wall read, "In loving memory of Eleanor Hartley, who taught us that genuine care is love made visible." Kelly stood beside me, holding baby Claire. The baby had grown beautifully, her cheeks round and healthy, her eyes bright and curious. After the ceremony ended, we walked together along the public footpath through my protected woods. The trees were just beginning to show early spring buds, promising new growth and renewal. Claire made soft cooing sounds. Kelly smiled, the first truly peaceful smile I'd seen on her face in many months. "Mom," she said softly, squeezing my hand. Thank you for everything. I looked out at the forest, at the clear creek running cold and clean over ancient smooth stones. I thought about my mother, about the life I'd built through hard work and determination, about the difficult battles I'd fought and won. I am not bitter, I whispered to my tiny granddaughter, though she was far too young to understand the words. I am rooted. And standing there in the woods my mother had loved so deeply, holding my daughter's hand while she held her own daughter, I finally felt complete peace. Not because I'd won some victory, but because I'd stood my ground when it mattered most.